Okay, let's get started. Let's do some learning, okay? Now we are moving into the exciting topic of, oh, by the way, we have two people joining us from Florida. Jackie Fisher. Jackie, how are you? How's Florida? Nice to have you. Brenda, are you in Florida?
Yeah,
Brenda's here. Sue Talansky, I think, is in Florida. I'm not sure she's
I'm
on
in
video.
Florida for 3 days, but I didn't want to miss the class.
All right, that's great. Well, thank you, Sue. Sue and Jackie from Florida. Nice to have you with us. Baruch Hashem, we're becoming an international, well, not international, but interstate, right? A national class. Maybe we'll go international one day. Who knows?
Let's go international.
Okay. All right. So now we're going to move into this very exciting topic of census. Numbers, counting. And I promise you we will not stay here long, but I did want to at least point out some of the interesting observations when it comes to the counting. We're on page 878. Now remember, Bnei Yisrael were counted a few times. When were they counted? When was the first time Bnei Yisrael were counted? Okay. All right, everybody. Good morning. Boker Tov. It's 9:28. We should all know this. When was the first time Bnei Yisrael were counted? What? At the start of the journey. Actually, before the start of the journey. I mean, they were already in the desert. The first count took place with the Machzit HaShekel, right? With the giving of that half shekel that was required for the building of the Mishkan, right? And then 7 months later, there was another counting. This was the counting that we read about at the very beginning of Chumash Bamidbar when we started. What was the total? The total was 603,550. Everybody rounds it off to 600,000, right? But 603,550. That was the total of the second census. 603,550. What was the total of the first census? 7 months before that.
601?
603,550. Wait a second. In 7 months, nobody was born and nobody died?
Well, why didn't they were born, but they were equal.
Good. So it didn't matter if anybody was born. Why? Because we only counted people from the age of 20 to 60. We only counted men from the age of 20 to 60. So we don't have to worry about somebody being born. Nobody turned 20. In those 7 months, nobody turned 20. So one explanation is we don't go by birthdays. In all due respect, Chava, right? We don't go by birthdays. What do we go by? How old I don't know where she is. How old you were at Rosh Hashanah. Right? We go by how old you were at Rosh Hashanah. This is Rashi's position. We go by how old you were at Rosh Hashanah. If you were 20 at Rosh Hashanah, if you were older than 20 at Rosh Hashanah, if you were 21 at Rosh Hashanah, then they counted you in the census. If you were 20 or below at Rosh Hashanah, then they didn't count you for the census. What happened if you turned 20 during the year, or you turned 21 during the year? We don't care. According to Rashi, we're only interested in how old you are at Rosh Hashanah. And since these 7 months didn't include a Rosh Hashanah, there was no problem. So that's why there was no increase based on anyone turning of age. Okay, no question of people being born because we only counted from above 20. No question of people turning age according to Rashi because we went by how old you are on Rosh Hashanah. What was the question? So what then is the only question that remains? Nobody died. In those 7 months from the time of the Machzis HaShekel until the time of the counting at the beginning of Chodesh Bamidbar, nobody died. So Rashi says, correct. Nobody under the age of 60 died during that time. That was one of the miracles, that nobody under the age of 60 died during that time. That's why those first two counts, says Rashi, are exactly the same. It's not a coincidence, right? 603,550 at the time of the Machzis HaShekel, and 603,550 at the time of the actual physical count in beginning of Bamidbar, Rashi says that was reflective of a miracle that nobody died during that time. Okay? The Ramban disagrees. The Ramban says, what are you talking about? The numbers 603,550 and 603,550 is a pure coincidence, says the Ramban. Because the Ramban says we started counting you not based on how old you are at Rosh Hashanah, but according to the Ramban, we started counting you based on how old you were when your birthday happened. In other words, according to the Ramban, we counted you at your birthday, not at Rosh Hashanah. So if you turned 21 in those 7 intervening months between the giving of the Machzah Shekel and the first count and the second count, so you would have been new. You would have been a new person. You would have added 1 to the number. And says the Ramban, there were people who died, right, during that time. And that would have subtracted 1 from the number. If you were under 60 and you died during that time, that would have subtracted 1 from the number. The Ramban disagrees with Rashi. There was no miraculous period where nobody died. People die. So people died during that time also, during those 7 months in the desert. And just, some people turned 20, some people died, but the Ramban says something even bigger. The first count of the Machzis HaShekel, right? Did that include Shevet Levi? Did that include the Levium? The answer is yes. The Machzis HaShekel included the Levium. The second count at the beginning of Chumash Bamidbar didn't include the Levium. You remember why? Anybody remember why? Why didn't it include the Levium? Because Hashem wanted to keep the Levium out of the count because the Levium were not going to die in the desert. But all of these people who were counted would die in the desert, with the exception of Yehoshua and Caleb, and maybe some at the very end. Right? So Hashem wanted to keep the Levium separate. This is what we learned way back in Chumash Bamidbar. Hashem wanted to keep the Levium separate. So now, what's the question? So now it's a bigger question to Rashi. Right? According to the Ramban, we understand some people turned of age, some people died. There were enough and 22,000 Levium were not counted. So there were the numbers worked out. It just happened to be coincidentally, says the Ramban, that it's 603,550. Very nice. According to Rashi, now it's a problem. Right? Rashi doesn't explain what happens with the Levium. So according to Rashi, what do you have? According to Rashi, you have, the age. You counted people only on how old they were at Rosh Hashanah, so there was no change of that from that perspective. And according to Rashi, miraculously, nobody died. What happened to the Levium seems to be an open question with Rashi. Okay, that was the first 2 counts. When was the third count? Now, this is the third count. Why is there a census now? We learned why. Because of the plague that happened with Baal Peor, because of everything that happened, we understand now why there's a census. Hashem wants to count us. Hashem wants to see, who's left, so to speak. And we saw that interesting observation that it was primarily the Eruv Rav that died. Okay. How does the third census work out regarding the first 2 censuses? Right? The first census, 603,550, the first 2 censuses. What was the number of this census? What was the total of this census? Do we get a total or do we have to add it all up? Yeah, we get a total, right? We get a total. Pasuk 51. Right, Pasuk 51, what's the total? 601,730. We're about 2,000 people short of what was then, right? 2,000 people, about 2,000 people short of what was then. But what's interesting about this count? The people are not the same people, right? The 603,550 people who were counted at the beginning of Chumash Bamidbar, and the 601,730 people who are counted now are 99.999% not the same people. Why? Because what happened to those 603,550 people who were counted at the beginning of Chumash Bamidbar? They died in the desert. They died in the desert. So we're talking about a whole new set of people being counted, a whole new set of people being counted, people who were younger than 20, or people who were 20 or younger when they left Mitzrayim. Those people have now grown up, right? So we have to imagine there were a tremendous amount of, right? How many of those individuals? A lot, right? A lot, right? Hundreds of thousands. And we have to imagine that, people died. We have all these people who were dying, plus people died in the plague, of the 603,550. I'm sure there were people who died in all of these plagues. And it's a numerological coincidence that this number now is close to the number that was at the beginning of Chumash Bamidbar. Because there have been 40 years or 39, 38 years, basically, that have intervened between these two numbers. And in these 38 years, 603,550 approximately people have died. So that the number is relatively close is a fascinating discussion. Now, remember, this doesn't include women. The women didn't die in the Midbar, right? The women who came out of Mitzrayim, by and large, were the women who went into Eretz Yisrael. Now, maybe there were some women who passed away in the Midbar, right? There were women who were born in the Midbar, clearly. But the women between the ages of 20 and 60 at the time of Yetzias Mitzrayim, they didn't die. I mean, they didn't die in the plague. They were able to come into Eretz Yisrael. So the women came in, Shevet Levi came in, Yehoshua and Kalev came in, and maybe there were 1,500 people who might have come in, because there's a question, what happened that very last year? Did people die or did they not die? Okay, so this is our number, 601,730. What happened within the tribes? Do we see any anomalies within the tribes? I mean, we certainly see changes. So I'll just give you I'll just throw out one change to you. At the first census, Shevet Ruvain was 46,500. How many were Shevet Ruvain in this census? In this census, they were 43,700. So they went down, right? They went down. Pretty much, I'm just looking at all of the other Shvatim. So Ruvain went down, Shimon went down, Gad went down, Yehuda went up by 2,000 people, Yisachar went up almost 10,000 people, Zvulun went up about 3,000 people. So we have some tribes that are going down, and we have some tribes that are going up. Is that surprising to us? No, right? I mean, this is normal fluctuations in population. We should not be surprised. Up a couple thousand, down a couple thousand, we should not be surprised. There's one Shevet that stands out here. And what Shevet is that? Shevet Shimon. What's the number of Shimon here in our census? So if you look, you'll see the number of Shimon is given at 22,200. So we have this idea that what happened is that Bnei Yisrael literally encamped in these ways in the Midbar, and that mirrored how they followed, or how they led, because they surrounded on all four sides of Yaakov Avinu's beer. That's how they traveled from Mitzrayim back to Hebron. Okay, good.
Can I ask a question about the tribal count?
Of course.
When you count Levi and Yosef, you get 12. When you don't count Levi and you count Ephraim and Manasseh, you get 12. But when you count Levi, Ephraim, and Manasseh, you get 13.
Okay.
Marvin and I have had fights about this.
Well,
Can you clarify, please?
So you're both right. Chas v'shalom, I should get in between you and Marvin. Right? You're both right. There are either 13 or 12 tribes, depending upon how you count them. At the beginning of this coming week's parsha, the beginning of Vayechi, right, what do we see? Yaakov says to Yosef that the children who were born to you before I came to Mitzrayim, namely, who were the children who were born to him? Ephraim and Menashe. So Ephraim and Menashe will be to me like Reuben and Shimon. So what did Yaakov do? Yaakov took Yosef's two children and elevated them to the status of Shvatim. Obviously, Menashe and Ephraim were not part of the original Shvatim, but Yaakov elevated them to the original Shvatim. When Yaakov elevated them to the original Shvatim, they essentially took Yosef's place, because now Yosef is getting a double portion. Before he was just one, he was just Yosef, and now he's two. He's Ephraim and Menashe. So even though the number 12 stays the same, Yosef drops out, and Ephraim and Menashe come in. But if Yosef drops, if there's 12 with Yosef, and Ephraim and Menashe come up, and Yosef drops out, how many should there be?
13.
There should be 13, right? There should be 13. So if you count, so in order to get to 12, what do you have to take out?
Levi.
Shevet Levi. You have to take out Shevet Levi, and we know that Shevet Levi was not counted in the census together with everyone else. Shevet Levi were counted in a separate census. So how many tribes were there? The classic answer is there were 12 tribes. But if you're going to count everybody, there were 13 tribes. Okay, so that's only because Yaakov elevated Menashe and Ephraim to the status of tribes. So depending upon the reason for counting, there were either 12 or 13 tribes. Chagall only did 12 windows, so that's the Machriya, right? Chagall only did 12 windows, so from there we know that we generally go by the number of 12 when we talk about the number of tribes. Okay, but Fern, you reminded me of one interesting thing. In the previous count, Ephraim came before Menashe, and in this count, Menashe comes before Ephraim. Why is that? Interestingly, in the prior count, Ephraim's family was more numerous than Menashe's family. But what happened over the 38 years in the Midbar? Menashe became more numerous than Ephraim, and he was counted first in this count. Okay.
But I thought you said it went in the order of encampment.
It did, but they're both in the same encampment. So within the encampment, they were both. They're still in that. It's Ephraim, Menashe, and Binyamin still in that encampment. Okay. So what's the purpose of this counting? We said since it's counting between 20 and 60, the primary purpose of this counting was to prepare for going into Eretz Yisrael and for conquering the land. But now there is another purpose, which we'll see. Let's jump ahead in our parsha. We're skipping pages and psukim. I hope you're all very happy. Right? We're going to page 884. And on page 884, what are we told? 884, the pasuk tells us, "Vayidaber Hashem al Moshe lemor." Hashem says to Moshe, "La'ele techale ka'aretz b'nachala b'mispar shemos." Right? What is Hashem saying? What was the whole purpose for the census, or the second purpose for the census, was that the land should be divided up as an inheritance according to these names. According to these names. So what does it mean according to these names? So, meaning according to the names that we just mentioned and the families that we just mentioned, according to them, La Rav, the next pasuk Nundadal, La Rav Tarbe Nachalaso, for the many they get more land, V'lama'at Tam'it Nachalaso, and for the fewer they get less land. Ish lefi pekudav, each one according to their numbers, to his number, yutan nachalaso, his portion shall be given. And the third pasuk here, ach bigoral yechalek es haaretz. However, the land should be divided up only by a lottery. Lishmos matos avosam yinchalu, and the lottery should be going according to these different tribes and families. Al pi hagoral techalek nachalaso bein rav lama'at. What the heck? What's going on? If I were to ask you, how is the land of Israel divided, what would you tell me? I don't know. These psukim that we just learned seem to say two things. One pasuk, right, says clearly, pasuk nun daled says clearly, la rav tarbe nachalaso, v'la ma'at tam'it nachalaso. What does that mean? How was the land divided up? By population.
By numbers.
By numbers.
By volume of
right?
people.
More people got more land. If your tribal family had more people, you got more land than the next tribal family that had fewer people.
But you didn't get the same amount. In other words, each person didn't get the same amount.
Hold on. We have to understand, right? Remember, we're looking at this from our perspective. So what happened? Everybody got a house. Everybody got like a front yard, a backyard. Some people get bigger yards. Some people get 3-car garages. Some people didn't have garages. Some people had detached garage. Like, how did that work? We have to understand that it wasn't divided up in exactly that way. And when we come, we'll learn the divisions. In other words, Shevet Ruvain was given this land, this section of the land. Why? Because Shevet Ruvain had the numbers to require this section of land. Shevet Shimon, on the other hand, was given this section of land. Why? Because Shevet Shimon's numbers were much less. Okay? That would seem to tell us, La Rav Tarbe Nachalaso, V'Lama'at Tamit Nachalaso, that based on numbers, that's how the land was divided. You had more people, you needed more land. You had less people, you needed less land. Did that mean that everybody was given a deed to, a piece of land 6 by 6? Not exactly. But the basic idea was more people required more land, less people required less land, and that's how the land was divided up. Okay? Does that not seem to be the way from the pasuk? That seems to be exactly what the pasuk is telling us. And then the pasuk goes ahead and says, "Ach, however, bigoral yechalek es haaretz." No. The land's not divided up by numbers. How is the land divided up? By lottery. The land is divided up by lottery. So what do you have? You have this idea that it seems to be, okay, come, everybody reach into the basket, pick out a description of, Beverly, hang on just a second, pick out a description of land, and that's where you're going to go live. Does that seem to have anything to do with numbers?
No,
what does that have to do?
But if you have more people from your family taking a vote,
No, it wasn't. Well, I hear what you're saying. No, it wasn't like that. Right? It was a representative of each Shevet. There was one representative of Reuven picked where the Shevet Reuven would live. One representative from Shimon picked where Shevet Shimon would live. So it was those people. The picks were equal. There were 12 pieces of paper. Obviously, they weren't pieces of paper, but whatever they used in those days, right? 12. I don't know what I do with the lottery today. Ping pong balls, right? 12 ping pong balls with numbers on them. So there were 12 ping pong balls with with descriptions of where in Israel. Right? You go into the country, you turn left, you turn right. All that's where it was divided.
But the lottery could be for the location of the plots rather than the size of the plot.
Okay, but before we so Beverly's suggesting a possible resolution, but Beverly, we're still working on understanding the question. Right? One pasuk says divided up by population. Another pasuk says divided up by lottery. If I divide it up by population, so then the land is given based on human needs. If I divide it up by lottery, then what makes the determination of the land? Is lottery luck? Nope. Hashem. Right? Right, Hashem. Right? So we seem to have two different views as to how the land was divided up. According to one, the first pasuk that we learned, the land was divided up solely based on population. meaning us-based, or it was us. You had more children, you got more land. You had less children, you got less land. And then the second pasuk seems to say, no, the land was divided up by a Kadosh Baruch Hu. It was divided up by lottery. And then the third pasuk comes along and says what? Al pi hagoral techalek nachalaso bein rav lama'at. Right? That according to the lottery, the land would be divided bein rav lama'at, taking into account those who had more and those who had less. So what does that mean? So the Meforshim understand and explain that miraculously, we shouldn't be surprised, but that miraculously, the areas of land that were chosen by each representative from the lottery matched up to their population needs. Okay? So Reuven reached into the basket and picked out the boundaries of his land in Eretz Yisrael. And when you looked at the boundaries of his land in Eretz Yisrael, and Shimon reached into the basket and took out his boundaries. When you looked at Reuven's boundaries, they were larger because Reuven had more people. When you looked at Shimon's boundaries, they were smaller because Shimon had fewer people. So the lottery miraculously corresponded to the population. Okay, so why do I need both of them? If that's the case, then just do the lottery or just do the population. If in the end it's going to come out the same way, which it did, because miraculously the lottery and the population jived together at the end. If it's going to come out the same way, why do both? Well, it's hard to argue if you're counting numbers. I mean, yes, in America we argue, based on numbers. Is the census accurate? Is it not accurate? Here we have to assume that the census was accurate. But what's the idea here? So the idea here is that Kadosh Baruch Hu wanted to make sure that we knew that the distribution of the land in Israel was not solely based on people's needs, but based on where Hashem wanted you to be. Right? People's needs were taken into account, but they were corroborated by where Hashem wanted you to be. So you, Reuven, let's say Reuven, you needed a piece of land in Israel of 50 square miles.